I'm Rona Seidelman. I'm the director of the Schusterman Center. So now a bit about our speaker. Misha Klein is a beloved member of the Schusterman Center for many years now. She's an associate professor of anthropology, and she's affiliated with the Center for the Americas, the Brazil Study Center, and the Schusterman Center for Judaic and Israel Studies, as well as the Department of Women and Gender Studies. She received her PhD in anthropology in 2002 from the University of California at Berkeley. Her primary research is in Brazil and addresses the relationship between ethnic and national identity with the multicultural and transnational Jewish population as her entry point into an exploration of the meanings of race, class, and belonging. Her book, Kosher, you want me to try it? If Kosher Feijoada, Kosher Feijoada and Other Paradoxes of Jewish Life in Sao Paulo is based on her ethnographic fieldwork in the city of Sao Paulo, and I think it was over 6 years of living in the city and ethnographic fieldwork. And it's going to be soon published in Portuguese in Brazil. And in addition to her book, she's published numerous important articles on race, Jewish identity, and gender. In addition, she is a fierce advocate for social justice. For over 10 years, Misha served as chair of the Clyde Snow Social Justice Award Committee, and she was recognized in 2019 with the Oklahoma Universal Human Rights Award, and in 2021 with OU's Regents Award for Superior Teaching. Her talk today, Philosemitism Without Jews, Political Uses of the Imaginary Jew in Brazil, draws from her newest research project. And this is a collaboration with historian Michel German from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And this is an exciting international interdisciplinary project, which she'll be telling us more about today. As a sort of personal note, and I said this, sort of a version of this when we had our Rosh Hashanah reception earlier this year, but when I think of Misha, I think of someone who pushes the people around her to think in new directions and who is constantly seeking out new knowledge for herself and who speaks truth to power. She is a beloved and valued member of the Schusterman Center, and she will be incredibly missed when she retires at the end of the year. And I'm incredibly grateful to everything she's done for and given to this center over the years. And I'm incredibly grateful to have her speak with us today. So please join me in welcoming our speaker, Misha Klein.
Allergies. So, hello everyone. I want to acknowledge that when we talked about the date for this talk last spring, was it, that we were talking about it? It just I didn't realize what today was. It was so far in advance that of the US election that I didn't realize how many of us would be feeling raw and worried, regardless of the outcome. But I think I don't need to explain to most of you how you are feeling, obviously. And I'm here to talk to you about an aspect of right-wing extremism. So that makes it, I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing. We'll find out. But it's also a bit about the elections, as you'll see. So I'm hoping that I provide you a little bit of distraction or entertainment. But worries aside, I do want to give a very warm thanks to both Professor Alan Levinson and to Professor Rona Seidelman for the invitation to give this talk. And I have to acknowledge Trice Hyman, whose organizational and technological skills are always very impressive. I also want to thank the Department of Anthropology and the Center for the Americas and the Center for Brazil Studies that are co-sponsors of this talk. They're all other homes of mine here on campus. And I also want to thank all of you for crawling out from under the covers and stepping out into the light and joining us today. So I hope to enlighten you. I hope to, as I say, entertain perhaps a little bit, and I look forward to your questions and your comments. Today's talk pulls on a few of many entangled threads at the center of an ongoing collaborative research project that I've been pursuing since 2016 with historian Michel German from the Federal University in Rio de Janeiro. When I get asked what my research is about, I often find it hard to know where to begin, which thread I should pull on first. We began our collaboration with an examination of the changing concept of race in Brazil in light of some policy changes that were set in motion following the 2001 United Nations World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance that was held in Durban, South Africa. However, before we could get very far with that particular aspect of the project, we collided with the 2018 Brazilian presidential election, or the campaign rather. And part of the reason that we collided is that Jews figured quite prominently in that campaign. In fact, Jews and Jewish themes have continued to take center stage in Brazilian politics. And this is in spite of the fact that Jews represent just a small fraction of 1% of the overall Brazilian population. So this is just one of many reasons why this evocation of Jewishness is symbolic and not, for example, a political ploy to try to attract Jewish votes, which would be totally insignificant. Furthermore, our focus on Jewish themes is not because we're imposing some kind of Jewish perspective on Brazilian society, but because of a shift that's happened in the Brazilian political grammar and vocabulary. It seems like every time we seek to return to the theme of race, another headline-grabbing moment demands our attention. So with that said, let's begin with the relative present. In his opening speech at the 37th Summit of the African Union in February 27th of this year, the President of Brazil, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, familiarly known as Lula, compared the war in Gaza to the Holocaust, igniting a firestorm of criticism from Israel and its supporters, and resulting in his being declared a persona non grata and unwelcome in Israel until he apologizes. 1 week later, on February 25th, at a previously planned mass rally in support of ex-President Jair Bolsonaro, who may soon be jailed for corruption, we'll have to see, there was a crowd of widely divergent estimates, somewhere between 200,000 and 1 million supporters who filled the avenue, the Paulista Avenue in the city of São Paulo. Conspicuously intermingled among the gold and green sea of supporters were those who were wearing and carrying blue and white Israeli flags. Much of the national and international coverage of the rally led with observations of the many Israeli flags carried and worn by Bolsonaro's supporters. This media coverage presumed that what appeared to be a tremendous show of support for Israel was a direct response to President Lula's comments the week before. Though some attendees certainly brought flags of their own, flags were also available for purchase at the rally, with Israeli flags on hand for 50 reais, which is the equivalent of roughly $10 US, but also the equivalent of more than a day's wages, according to the national minimum salary. Brazilian flags were also available for sale, but for slightly less at 40 reais. Journalists approached Bolsonaro supporters in the crowd and asked why they carried the Israeli flag, and were told that it was because we're Christian, like Israel. While apparently confused, these assertions draw on what was already a well-established discourse that has circulated widely in Brazil for over a decade. Though still considered the world's largest Catholic country, Brazil has seen a meteoric rise of evangelical Christianity, as is the case in much of Latin America. This shift has been accompanied by changes in language, such as the use of the term Christian instead of Catholic, and changes in the symbolism that is used to support and represent national values. There's much more at play that is not evident to those who are only now seeing this incongruous display of apparent support for Israel. For one thing, the rally was not, in fact, about Israel, in spite of the Israeli flags that were visible throughout. Most prominently, ex-President Jair Bolsonaro was positioned atop a trio eléctrico, which is like a a mobile soundstage, waving the Israeli flag while he and others addressed the crowd. Beside him, his wife, Michele, opened the event with a speech that was a blend of giving thanks, leading a prayer, and recounting a tale of persecution, underscoring a fable of Christian grievance. Tying this persecution to her husband's rise to power, she declared, "Ever since 2017, we have suffered. We suffer because we exalt the name of God in Brazil, because my husband was chosen and declared that it was God above everything," she said, quoting from his campaign slogan. The former First Lady, who was herself gaining prominence on the political scene, spoke for 15 minutes from her position as a Christian woman, during which time she made it clear that the rally was about Brazil and her husband as its rightful and righteous leader. She said, "It pleased the Lord to put us in front of this nation. It pleased God to put us in the presidency of the Republic so that we would work and do real social justice in the lives of those who most need it. And today, the Brazilian people know the difference between a just government and one that is impious." She went on to say, "We are here today on this important day to say that we love Brazil, to say that we are not here with a goal of power, but for the purpose of liberty, for the purpose of prosperity for Brazil, so that we can be used as instruments for blessing people, to deliver our children from death, to bring food to the needy, to protect our widows." No doubt there are others who have been deconstructing her speech, including her use of these and other typical right-wing emotional appeals to save the children and the widows and the needy and the vulnerable, except for the kind that they don't like. However, my purpose here today is to illustrate and explain the uses of Israel and Jews in the current discourse of the political far right. So it behooves me to point out that rather than a speech condemning the current president for his criticism the week before of Israel's management of the war in Gaza, Michele Bolsonaro did not mention Israel or geopolitics at all. Her only oblique reference to the current government was to call it impious. The only time she mentioned Israel directly was in a statement that got more media attention than anything else she said, and it was the final exalted moment of her prayer cum speech. She said, "I praise your name and thank you, Father. I ask you to keep watch over our lives and that your true shalom be within the walls of Israel." Yes, she said shalom. "We bless Brazil. We bless Israel in the name of Jesus. Amen. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Glory to God." As remarkable as this was, it was far from an isolated incident. Indeed, this was one of many moments from the last decade of political upheaval in Brazil that make it clear that this particular evocation of Israel and Israeli symbols carries other meanings. Moving a little further back in time, take, for example, the Brazilian national election in 2022. Among the many discordant and dissociative moments of the election, one in particular stands out as needing explication and can help us illuminate what all those people were doing with Israeli flags on the Avenida Paulista. Once again, this moment involved the then First Lady of Brazil, Michele Bolsonaro, then the wife of President Jair Bolsonaro, who was running for re-election for a second term. In this photo, taken on the day of the second round on October 30th, 2022, this photo and others circulated widely on social media the day after the election. In this photo, the First Lady posed in front of the ballot box, smiling and making the peace sign with her fingers and wearing a blue t-shirt. Printed on the front of her shirt was an image of the Israeli flag. The shirt itself was baby blue, a lighter blue than the celestial blue of the Brazilian flag and lighter than the Mediterranean blue of the Israeli flag. And I point this out not to make a random or casual comparison, but point this out because what is at stake was no less than the significance of these two countries, their national symbols, and the relationship between them. This appearance of the Israeli flag in the explicit context of Brazilian national politics would be interesting enough on its own to merit a critical analysis. However, this moment was made even more curious by the fact that the image was not of the entire Israeli flag. Indeed, the flag on her shirt was composed of vertical strips, not as though it had been torn by hand, but more like it had been put through a shredder. Upon examination of the image, my colleague and anthropologist of religion, Professor Cristina Vital of the Fluminense Federal University in Brazil, commented that it looked like a barcode. In a neoliberal transnational context, within which anything can be subjected to the process of commodification and transformed into merchandise, this particular product demands our attention and calls to question what exactly is it that is being marketed. A t-shirt with the image of a flag of another nation could be propaganda for that other nation, but what would the goal of such propaganda be? How are we to understand its meaning in the Brazilian context? I would like to suggest that the use of the Israeli flag in the Brazilian political context, and specifically the way it has appeared in protests and rallies organized by the far right in Brazil over the last decade, is distinct from its more familiar uses in both international context and Jewish context, in which the Israeli flag has represented a variety of meanings, from allegiance to a country of origin or citizenship, as well as in protests to critique that country. It has also come to be a symbol of religious faith, in which this symbol of a modern nation signifies adhesion to the religion of the ancient Israelites and their descendants, the Jewish people. In the present moment, the Israeli flag has acquired other meanings and uses depending on how people position themselves, both religiously and geopolitically. However, these varied uses do not explain the meaning of this gesture by Michele Bolsonaro. This image of the First Lady of Brazil wearing this t-shirt signifies much more than a simple commodification of the symbol and cannot be reduced to a celebration of the economic relations between the two countries, for example. Among other things, and perhaps primarily, what makes this compelling is the choice of the then First Lady to exercise her electoral rights as a citizen of Brazil while wearing a t-shirt that suggests support for another country. This widely circulated Barbie parody mocks Michele Bolsonaro's version of patriotism with the inclusion of the flag of the United States, the Israeli flag on her t-shirt, and an ankle monitor that many critics hope she and her husband will soon be sporting. However amusing this parody might be, I want to repeat that this is not a new use of the Israeli flag. Indeed, it is now part of a recognizable and expected repertoire of symbols for what we must now recognize as a new political identity. To understand the meaning of the t-shirt worn by Michele Bolsonaro, which is really serving here as an entry point into a morass of symbolic appropriations, expropriations, and resignifications, we now turn to the public and political uses of this and other Jewish and Israeli symbols over the past decade of political turmoil in Brazil. Ever since the mass demonstrations in 2013 that led up to the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff and initiated a right-wing takeover of the Brazilian government, the Israeli flag has been used by elements of the Brazilian far right in political contexts, along with other symbols of the Jewish state and Judaism. As part of our research, we have been examining these uses in order to understand this nationalist discourse that draws in the symbols of another nation. The appearance of these symbols in political contexts accompanies the rise of the evangelical right in the evangelical wing of the Brazilian New Right. However, we do not see these uses as constituting religious communication, let alone an expression of Philosemitism. So I don't leave anyone behind for those unfamiliar with this term because it is used far less in English. The prefix philo means a love for or an affinity for, which in this case would suggest that Philosemitism is the opposite of anti-Semitism, but that's actually not its history. It's my hope that today you'll come to see that these and other uses of Jewish and Israeli symbols are very far from expressions of love or appreciation for Israel or Jews. Before I get too much further, I want to explain that the formal Jewish community in Brazil has tended to interpret these uses as expressions of support for Israel. For many in the Brazilian Jewish community, this support is welcome, especially after the distrust of the first Lula administration due to Lula and his administration's support for Palestinian self-determination. As such, many Brazilian Jews believe that when right-wing Brazilian politicians display the Israeli flag, this signifies support for Israel, and therefore they have thrown their support behind the right wing, including Bolsonaro. Meanwhile, Bolsonaro encourages this interpretation with visits to Israel, pictured at the Wailing Wall, photographed while being baptized in the Jordan River, and offering his unwavering support for right-wing Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, and this was even before Netanyahu reclaimed the office of the prime minister. Those who can read Hebrew will note that what is written above is not quite Hebrew. Among other things, it is written from left to right. Some of you may already be aware that that this discourse and the political appropriations of Jewish and Israeli symbols are not limited to the Brazilian context. Although there are some parallels elsewhere, this has occurred to a far lesser extent in the United States, where Trump has not garnered nearly as much support from Jews. Indeed, Trump repeatedly warned Jews to line up behind him or be held accountable for his electoral loss. We dodged that bullet. Nevertheless, during the violent insurrection on January 6th, 2021, there were Israeli flags carried by some in the crowd at the US Capitol, connecting unwavering support for Trump to uncritical support for Israel. I can hardly imagine a more extreme appropriation than the use of the shofar, which is an instrument that is made from a ram's horn and used in the most solemn moments of Jewish religious observance, as it was used by some of the participants in the insurrection. While some of the shofars seen in the crowd were painted with the stars and stripes of the US flag, in one video, it was shown being blown through the broken window of the breached Capitol building. Rather than a call to the Jewish people for spiritual reawakening, this was a call to arms. Returning to Brazil, it's important to consider these deployments of Israel and Jewish symbols alongside other uses, such as by the sons of Jair Bolsonaro, in this case wearing T-shirts with the emblem of the IDF, the Israel Defense Force, and the Mossad, which is Israel's secret service. These men are not only the sons of the former president, but they are also elected officials themselves, so it is worth pondering what it means when a politician of one country engages in political propaganda for another country. It is even more curious when the other country is invoked as a means to promote a particular flavor of nationalist politics. In other words, there are many ways to show support for the values and efforts of another country, as we have seen, for example, in relation to Russia's war on Ukraine, when Ukrainian flags have appeared on everything from social media profiles to yard signs. This is rhetorical support. However, there is a critical distinction between expressions of support by the general population and the use of these symbols by elected politicians, especially when these acts are specifically connected to the exercise of their responsibilities as citizens, and even more so to their responsibilities as statesmen, and indeed as expressions of a particular brand of patriotism. It's also worth highlighting that these same acts of exhibiting foreign flags, let alone aligning with a foreign military or secret service, if they were carried out by Jews, whether citizens or politicians, the bearers would be accused of duplicity, often coded in the familiar accusations of being cosmopolitan and internationalist, that is, of lacking patriotism, or even of being traitors. Accusations like these have a long transnational history and underlie recurrent moments of violent anti-Semitism. Meanwhile, in the hands and on the chests of non-Jewish Brazilian politicians, these same symbols signify patriotism and belonging. From a semiotic perspective, symbols don't have stable, let alone universal meanings. Their significations depend on context, including the prevailing discourses circulating in the environments within which they're disseminated. Israeli flags have featured in multiple political settings, from the infamous demonstrations in 2013 to the stage behind then candidate Jair Bolsonaro on his infamous speech at the Hebraica Club, a Jewish sport and social club in Rio de Janeiro in 2017. They also appeared in every rally in support of his candidacy, at his inauguration in 2018, and at events throughout his presidency. Considering these situations, it's clear that waving the Israeli flag denotes something well beyond and distinct from support for the state of Israel. Through processes of localization, which involve the intersection of politics with religion in a particular moment in this country's history, when supporters hoisted the Israeli flag during the electoral campaign, they were signifying support for Bolsonaro and his fascist and intolerant agenda. And I can't resist pointing out what I've included here in this slide, that his middle name is Messias, which means Messiah. Even more curious, the Israeli flag features a symbol, the Star of David, that 20 years prior in Brazil was practically unknown as a Jewish symbol. To illustrate, when I first arrived in Brazil at the end of 1992 and went straight to a small inland city, I was startled to see people wearing Stars of David, sometimes with a cross on the same chain. When I asked about it, I was surprised to hear that the wearers thought it was simply a pretty star, and so I learned not to read too much into the appearance of the six-pointed star beyond being a decorative element, especially when outside of the urban context of the cities of São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, where the majority of Brazilian Jews live. It was not much later than this that certain evangelical churches began to more ostentatiously incorporate Jewish symbols and practices into their services. The convergence of evangelical Christianity with Judaism, in which some churches promote themselves as offering a kind of roots Christianity, is evidenced in everything from the use of Jewish religious garments by non-Jews, such as here in Edir Macedo's rabbinic self-presentation, to the construction of the Temple of Solomon, colloquially known as the Third Temple in the city of São Paulo. In fact, the insight for the idea of Philosemitism without Jews that I've used as the title for this talk came while forcing myself to watch the two-part propagandistic biopic, Nothing to Lose, about the life and suffering of self-proclaimed Bishop Edir Macedo. At one point in the narrative, in one of his many persecution crises, as he tried to understand why he was yet again the target of investigations, Macedo resolves to travel to the Holy Land for inspiration, to walk in the patriarch's footsteps. Throughout this sequence in Israel, that is modern Israel, not ancient Israel, because he's not a time traveler, throughout this sequence, there was no mention of Jews, nor did any appear in any of the scenes. This fetishism for Israel, for the literal dirt and rocks of the Holy Land, culminated years later in Macedo exporting from Israel the very stones with which he built the Third Temple on Brazilian soil.
Is that a real thing, that temple?
Yeah, see, that's it, in the middle of the city. It's full scale. However, it was really only with the mass rallies that started in 2013 that the Israeli flag began to make a public appearance outside of Jewish and evangelical contexts. In other words, this symbol has taken on a highly specific meaning in contemporary Brazil, one that is distinct from those meanings presumed by those who were familiar with it before its appropriation in the course of the rise of the new right wing. The zenith of these appropriations of all things Jewish was the appearance in bombastic speech that I mentioned earlier by then candidate and now ex-president Jair Bolsonaro at the Hebraica Club in Rio in April of 2017. My research partner Michelle German and I have spoken and written elsewhere about this speech, how it was offensive in innumerable ways, such that Bolsonaro practically made a caricature of himself, how the mostly Jewish audience laughed and cheered him on the repercussions for Bolsonaro and for the Jewish community, on the mostly Jewish protesters outside the club, which was the very first protest against Bolsonaro after he declared his candidacy, and how the community has split as a result. So we've written about this. I won't go into all of that now, but if you're interested, I can give you some things to read. The relevance of that speech for our purposes here is that Bolsonaro made use of the support of the mostly Jewish audience inside the club to cleanse himself of accusations of being fascist, accusations that he has not managed to shake until today. For Bolsonaro, this was a useful relationship with Jews, and this is Jews as sociopolitical objects rather than with Jews per se. This interest in Jews does not imply an interest in their well-being, in their ideas, nor in their survival as a people. Here, Jews are interesting for their symbolic value. As such, this fascination with Jewish and Israeli things is an expression of a type of Philosemitism without Jews that is the gentler side of anti-Semitism. As historians Adam Sutcliffe and Jonathan Karp note in their introduction to their volume Philosemitism and History, Philosemitism shares with anti-Semitism a trafficking in distorted, exaggerated, and exceptionalist views of Jews and Judaism. These examples give us a glimpse into the embedded meanings of such symbols. These references entangle meanings from ancient times to the present, from the sacred to the profane, and from the inhabited to the dehumanized. First, the Israel that's being referenced is ancient Israel, the Israel of King Solomon, the Israel of the Holy Land, where the patriarchs created what later became Christianity. This Israel is also the land to which all Jews need to return in anticipation of the second coming of the Messiah. In other words, this fascination with Israel has little to do with actual Jews, a diverse people with many complications, nor does it have to do with the Israel of today, a modern state that is even more complex. Rather, it has to do with Christian theological interests. Second, there's another Israel that is commended by politicians on the Brazilian right, which is precisely the modern state of Israel, but not the Jewish state itself, and much less Israeli society, which is far too diverse and contradictory for their purposes. I realize that this is an especially sensitive topic at the moment, but I ask you to not get distracted by the horrors presently unfolding in Israel and Palestine, and focus for the moment on the meanings that Israel has as an idea, as a symbol, and as an imaginary. For these far-right political actors in Brazil, the state of Israel represents a militarized ethno-state, a barrier against the imagined barbarism of the Muslims and Arabs all around it, and therefore a model of how to deal with those elements viewed as undesirable, both internal and external. It is no coincidence that the biggest security firms in São Paulo are Israeli, and that Israeli special forces provided security training to the Brazilian military and police ahead of the 2016 Olympics in Rio. Third, this Israel is also imagined not as a multicultural and multiracial society, that it is, but as a white nation. In contrast to the contemporary critiques of Israel as a white settler state, this imaginary is celebratory of whiteness, but similarly depends on a very narrow and incomplete understanding of Jews and European as white, ignoring yet another complex dimension of the plurality of Jewish peoples. This white Israel serves as inspiration for certain sectors of Brazilian society that have long sought to whiten Brazil, to reformulate the country's history, and to cleanse it of its non-white citizens, or at least significantly diminish their cultural and political influences. Bringing together these 3 points, the Israel denoted by these flags and other symbols in the Brazilian context is an expression of a right-wing evangelical imaginary that promotes a Brazil that is Christian, white, militarized, and capitalist. Thus, the Israeli flag in Brazil doesn't represent Israel per se, but instead represents a new community, or, if you will, a new ethnicity, but one that is organized around political ideology rather than ancestry. Embracing these intersecting imaginaries, it becomes possible to declare oneself Jewish without relinquishing Christianity, such as in the case of Bolsonaro's international advisor, Felipe Martins, who, when caught making a white supremacist gesture in a Senate session, tried to relieve himself of the accusations by declaring himself Judeu porém cristão, Jewish but Christian. And let's not forget the infamous case of disgraced former US Congress member with Brazilian origins, Jorge Santos, or whatever his real name is, who, among many of his stupefying lies, cynically declared himself to be Jewish, falsely identifying himself as Jewish according to halakhic laws without having any Jewish ancestry. However unique he might be in the US political stage, in this regard, Jorge Santos is not alone, but can be understood within this larger set of discourses. My research partner, Michel German, calls these public figures Jewish non-Jews, inverting the more familiar category of non-Jewish Jews articulated by Isaac Deutscher. These Jewish non-Jews assume responsibility for curating the category of Jew, which includes not accepting leftist or progressive Jews into this non-Jewish community. In the thinking of this new community, the definition of Jew, that is, of the imaginary Jew, does not permit criticism of the state of Israel, nor does it tolerate politics of inclusion in Brazil. As such, leftist Jews are divested of their Jewish identity. When I say imaginary, many of you are familiar with this, but it bears mentioning that I'm talking about the concept developed by social historian Benedict Anderson in his book on the formation of nationalism, Imagined Communities. As Anderson explains, a nation is imagined because the members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear of them, yet in the minds of each lives the image of their communion. For Anderson, the process of imagining is essential for the creation and maintenance of the nation, as a mental template that is materialized by way of certain technologies that allow dispersed peoples to think of themselves as cohering into a community, without knowing each other nor ever being likely to meet. In this sense, the imaginary is not something false or invented, but a vision or a projection, an understanding shared by a group, one that unifies this group behind an array of symbols and practices that turn these dispersed people into a community in formation, such as a nation in Anderson's original formulation, or as an ethnic group as seen among the many extensions of Anderson's concept. I wish to make clear that in questioning the declarations of Jewish non-Jews, I'm not interested in policing the boundaries of Judaism nor of Jewishness. The phenomena that we're exploring have developed concomitantly, but have not necessarily been driven by the growth of conversions, interest in crypto-Jews, or the reestablishment of Jewish identities by people who have discovered or come to believe that they have Jewish ancestry. Rather than evaluate the truth value of such claims, what captures my attention here is the appropriation of Judaism and Jewishness for other purposes without the agreement or participation of those with Jewish ancestry. Whether they like it or not, you might be thinking. Those excluded from the new community have other political orientations, as if political orientation were a quality that could supersede or dissolve ethnic identity. And yet we see evidence of this sort of thinking with seemingly greater frequency in political speech, including in the US. In this case, the community that is taking shape in Brazil is an ethno-political community, and one that joins a certain version of evangelical Christianity with a far-right political orientation. The Brazil that this community strives for, this Christian, white, and armed Brazil, is not a Brazil that is inclusive, multicultural, nor tolerant of difference. Within this framing, the apparent attraction to Jewish and Israeli things doesn't have anything to do with Jews per se, but with an imaginary Jew and an imaginary Israel that are deployed for other purposes. In the same way that anti-Semitism or any other manifestation of hate for the other is based on stereotypes that have little to do with Jews or other objects of hate. And Philosemitism is also based on stereotypes, though these are supposedly positive, though equally empty of Jews. Given this history, this context, and this appropriation of Jewish symbols for other purposes, let us return to this image of then First Lady Michelle Bolsonaro proudly wearing a t-shirt with the image of the Israeli flag, smiling for the cameras in front of the ballot box. Or if you prefer, the image of Michelle as former First Lady addressing the masses with a prayer for Israel in the name of Jesus. What could she possibly have meant by these choices of self-presentation? In my view, on the one hand, she was expressing support for her husband, who has celebrated his relationship with Israel in the strict sense of his vision and utility of that Middle Eastern country for his political purposes. First Lady Michelle was also displaying a type of patriotism that fuses Brazilianness with evangelical Christianity to the exclusion of so many other religions in the country, and supporting a vision of a white Brazil to the exclusion of the equal participation of so many other ethno-racial groups. Considering the bar-coded image of the Israeli flag, it could also be said that she was proclaiming a utilitarian commitment with Israel as a product, a good, a commodity to be sold to the electorate, one which presents Brazil dressed up as a democracy, but a democracy for the few. To the relief of many, in 2022, the Brazilian electorate opted for a less exclusionary country, as was celebrated at Lula's inauguration. Nonetheless, the rhetoric connecting Brazil with Israel, a rhetoric with deep roots in the national political discourse, continues to thrive. Though Bolsonaro has been banned from running for political office until 2030, his supporters are undeterred, as seen in the rally on the Avenida Paulista in February. With yesterday's election in the US, and with the results most of us are still trying to make sense of, I would like to leave you with 4 images from Brazil. One from November 2016, one from January 2017, one from this week, and one from today. Not in that order. So to give you some context, in the fall of 2016, I was teaching in Rio de Janeiro as part of Rio's now defunct OU in Rio program. In the months leading up to the election, I had noticed an awful lot of magazines on the newsstands that featured images from World War II, including many images of Hitler, and it caught my attention, and I thought this was a curious obsession. At the time, Bolsonaro was not yet a candidate for president, and the talk of fascism that has become so commonplace now had not yet gained momentum. Strangers who overheard me speaking English with my husband and my son would stop and ask if I thought that Trump could win the election, and I would laugh at the preposterous notion. In January 2017, to mark Trump's inauguration, the weekly news magazine Isto É came out with this cover asking, "Now what?" with the bold black words positioned on Trump's upper lip, conveying their concerns very effectively, especially when viewed from a distance on the dozens of copies hanging like fish scales in front of the newsstands on every sidewalk. Years before, in the aftermath of 9/11 during George Bush Jr.'s presidency, a colleague in Brazil had told me that he thought that all nations should be allowed to vote in US elections because they were so consequential for the entire world. Well, that will never happen. I have seen that sentiment echoed in the anxiety over where Trump will take the world if reelected, as expressed in these and other publications in Brazil in the past week. But there are certainly those in Brazil who are celebrating Trump's victory, including Bolsonaro and his supporters. So to keep things current, to the last possible minute, and to remind you to keep an eye out for both Michele Bolsonaro and the continued political uses of imaginary Israel, here's a tweet that she sent out today. So, of course, today brings me back to that morning exactly 8 years ago. I was in Rio de Janeiro and 4 hours ahead of Oklahoma time. I awoke early that morning, that next morning, just as the official news broke. And like so many of you, I was gutted. And I bundled my child off to school, and I was unable to stop the flow of tears. So I went for a long walk along the beaches of Leblon and Ipanema. Trying to calm my nerves, I strolled along the iconic black and white patterned sidewalk in the bright sunshine of a South American spring day and dodged people running and biking past the hardworking beach attendants hauling pallets of chairs to rent and coolers full of beer and coconut water to sell on the beach. Reminding myself to look up and to take in the sparkling water of the Atlantic Ocean, I was startled out of my stupor by this installation hanging from a tree, a kind of kinetic wordplay that was spinning in the breeze. Repare. I'd never thought about its many meanings until I saw it broken up like this. Repare. The verb reparar here in the imperative means to repair, to fix, to mend, but also to notice. But here broken up, I realized reparar also means to stop again. It was a directive to stop and to look and then to mend. And it recalled for me the Jewish social justice concept of tikkun olam. And a reminder that no matter the outcome or the circumstances, we cannot indulge ourselves, and we are called upon to heal the world. Thank you. And I would love your questions. Yes?
Has there been a particular Catholic response to this use of symbolism in Brazil?
Not something that's particularly Catholic to my knowledge. This is really much more focused on evangelical Christianity. And it's an interesting question because other places in Latin America where evangelical Christianity has linked up with some repressive forces has really drawn out of the Catholic Church an impulse to resist that. So there was liberation theology that emerged at the end of the 1960s. It was instrumental in the wars in Central America. So that will be something to watch. I think it depends on what direction things go. Yeah, Alan.
Thank you for a really good talk. I guess this is a little bit of a follow-up on Marshall's question, but also harkening back to the beginning of your talk. Like somehow get the feeling that evangelicals imported this pro-Israelism, I wouldn't really call it Philosemitism at all, into Brazil. And I guess I'm asking, is that right? And is it also entail a sort of idea that being pro-Israel, whatever that means to them, is a way of also being pro-American, but in what they misconstrue as a more overtly religious formulation?
Well, there is a kind of a way in which this discourse circulates. Well, any of the right-wing politicians are talking in this way. The question of the importation of evangelical perspective, it's much more obvious in places like in Central America, where there are actually first mainline Protestant churches and then evangelical churches from the US that were actually going there and evangelizing. Brazil broke off and created its own. It's got the mainline churches and it's got plenty of evangelical churches with roots elsewhere, but Macedo, whose mega church is now has branches here, that's homegrown. And so I would be hesitant to think about this as an importation. It's often more of an attempt at a dialogue than it is an attempt to copy. So it takes different forms. And so I would just be careful of too many equivalencies because the context really is quite different. And that Catholic base really sets things up in a very different way.
I realize my question had two parts now.
Okay.
So the second part, I'll kind of restate. Is Mrs. Bolsonaro under the impression, and her supporters under the impression, that Israel is composed of uniformly religious Jews?
They're not interested in the other ones. It's that's part of this this flattening of the category of the other, so that they frankly just divest. So just to, as I said, we've written about this. So that talk that Bolsonaro gave in a Jewish club in Rio that had Jews inside applauding him and Jews outside protesting him, the leadership of the Jewish community that organized that particular talk referred to the protest the next day as a pogrom. And the czarist armies attacking these Jewish communities. And the reason that I find that so incredibly compelling is they were basically saying that Jews with oppositional politics are more dangerous than the Tsar's army. They pose a threat to the community itself. So it's dangerous stuff. Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned briefly the Lula respect opinions about the Gaza war.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see also that Lula is using a technical Bolsonaro, utilizing the Israeli concept or the Jewish concept just for political purposes?
That's a really good question, and not one that I've thought of before, but I haven't seen any evidence of that. Lula didn't go after Bolsonaro for that. He went after Bolsonaro for a lot of other things, but I don't recall any of his criticisms being specifically about Israel. And I will look into that some more. But his comments, for example, that then Bolsonaro supporters in the media jumped on, had nothing to do with Bolsonaro. This was Lula as president speaking at the African Union and talking about geopolitics and stating his opinion about that war. But it wasn't about Bolsonaro. But that's a very interesting question, and frankly, if in fact Lula didn't use Israel to attack Bolsonaro in the way that Bolsonaro has used it to attack Lula, then I think that just reinforces the point that this morass of nationalist expression tied up with certain kinds of evangelical Christianity. Yeah.
Thank you for fascinating talk, and especially today. I was wondering whether Bolsonaro is flirting or was flirting with the alt-right, specifically with neo-Nazis, if they exist in Brazil, while loving Israel, supporting or being very pro-Israeli. So in what way the president Trump did, that he was especially in that big parade in Charlottesville.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know, conversing with Prime Minister Netanyahu that day, some of the supporters there were waving swastikas. So, wondering if that duality exists.
The relationship of Brazil to Nazis is very classical and neo is very is complicated because we know that, for example, there were Nazis who took refuge in Brazil following World War II, but they weren't welcomed in Brazil the way they were welcomed in Argentina, for example, where that was, Argentina threw open its doors and said, "Come." The Nazis who took refuge in Brazil hid, and this has a lot to do with some of the other things that we've written about. It has to do with national ideology about inclusion that was very much the dominant national ideology throughout the 20th century. So that attraction to Nazism hasn't gotten very far. That doesn't mean that there aren't there haven't been these movements, especially in the South where there were lots of lots of German immigrants. In Bolsonaro's case, he's trying to shed these criticisms of his being a fascist by going to places like these Jewish clubs. And I haven't seen widespread overt celebrations of Nazis. So you'll see the Israeli flag, but it's not like these rallies have Nazi flags. And that's where white nationalism takes, I think, a very different turn in Brazil. But again, we're trying to we keep getting hung up by these public, these events, and keep wanting to get back to, for example, exploring what happened in the aftermath of the conference in Durban, South Africa. Brazil and the United States had the two largest delegations, and the United States walked out of the conference together with Israel and a few other Western nations. Brazil stayed, and when the delegation came back to Brazil, they came back with the tools for finally acknowledging structural racism and established a secretariat, which became a ministry to address racism, and came with policies for quotas. So the kinds of conversations that have been happening about race and racism and the relationship to the nation we see a lot of the same ingredients, but they combine in different ways. So I definitely haven't seen any there's not been a history of overt anti-Semitism in Brazil. That was squashed. Jews have been incorporated into the anti-discrimination laws. So there are lots of things that are particularly Brazilian that have kept that from evolving. Hard to know now. Yeah.
Do you think Trump currently winning the US election here would bolster support for Bolsonaro?
It definitely makes Bolsonaro feel confident. I mean, there is this global set of connections between Bolsonaro and Trump and Netanyahu and Viktor Orban, and they're speaking the same language. Bolsonaro's been banned from running for office until 2030. Some of his supporters think they're going to put him forward in 2026, and I think that there is, some enthusiasm behind that. I gave up predicting the future in 2016.
One Zoom Q&A
Okay.
that I can read out to you. I'll just read it in full.
And then Paulo. Okay.
Thank you for this fascinating talk. Your talk expanded eloquently on how Israel is appropriated. I'm wondering why evangelicals and the far right are doing this amidst all the contradictions, i.e. evoking ancient Israel and almost claiming heritage while celebrating Jesus, who they say was killed by the Jews, the support of Israel, but the evocation of Nazi ideology, etc.
Yeah, it's really contradictory. There are people, religious scholars who know the theology that is being drawn on here, and there are passages, and frankly, it's just not my area, so I don't even retain it when I read it. I should be more embarrassed to mention that or to admit that. But I think that there are lots of contradictions, and the responses that a certain flavor of evangelical will give to that kind of a question will draw on certain kinds of passages in terms, also talking semiotically about what Trump's various moral failings actually represent. I really can't explain it, but it is contradictory. Did I answer all of that person's question? Paulo?
I think my question was sort of in the same vein, is that anti-Semitism has a different history in Nigerian culture, and it's mostly tied to conservative Christianity. When we think of Nazis as things, we don't think of anti-Semitism being necessarily linked to Christianity, but in Spain and Portugal, and then translated to Latin America, that anti-Semitism had everything to do with a very conservative, anti-modernity stance for Catholicism and Christianity as a whole. So, do you think there's a limit to this blindness because and I think it's fundamentally contradictory, this celebration. You've mentioned it's a purely imaginary celebration. And I wanted to ask you too if you've heard anything. I've heard some quite disturbing things from conservative evangelicals in Brazil about Jews being perfect Christians except for the fact that they don't accept Christ, which I find is a basically misunderstanding of the whole thing. But have you heard anything to that term?
The evangelical attraction to Jews, this idea that it's as if they're unevolved Christians. They didn't accompany the rest of Christianity. So there is you get extra points if you convert a Jew. It's a very there's an attraction there because there's this sense of shared roots, but then they haven't accepted Christ. The Star of David and the cross that I saw people wearing when I first got to Brazil, I'm looking around thinking, did Jews for Jesus have make these tremendous inroads into the interior of São Paulo? And that wasn't the case, but it does seem odd. But I found that so many people, this is also, I don't know if this came across as much as I would like. This is a change of the last 20 years. That when I first got to Brazil, outside of, frankly, not just certain cities, but certain neighborhoods in certain cities, these were not recognizable symbols. The Jewish institutions would have high walls and no markings, or if they had markings, it was Hebrew, but people, when you don't know what something is, you don't retain it. I knew someone in the interior who was wearing, in the city where I was living, she was wearing a necklace that had the letter Chai on it, which is a Hebrew letter. And it symbolizes life, and that's a long explanation for why that is. But it was a pendant, and it had the letter Chai on it. And I said to her, knowing that she was Catholic, I said, "Do you know what that is?" I said, she had no idea. She just liked it because her son brought it to her from his visit to the city of São Paulo. And I told her what it was. And a few weeks later, she was wearing it, and I brought it up again, and it was like the conversation had never happened. Because she didn't have a frame of reference. So when we talk about ignorance, people didn't know. And then to go from that in a couple of decades to this, not just appearance of, but prominence of these symbols is a major shift. But it's because they just mean something else entirely. And if you see in evangelical churches, there are menorahs, and the pastors are wearing Jewish prayer shawls and kippot, and they're just, but their treatment of Judaism is as if it were Christianity's unevolved little brother or something. So when people talk about Judeo-Christian culture, it is this way of just kind of erasing the differences, not just the theological differences, but historical differences as well. Thank you all so much for coming out on this day.